East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880. D. Migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880. D. From 1000 AD, East Africa received many groups of people coming from different directions. The new invaders included the Bantu from Niger or Congo Basin, the Ngoni from South Africa, the Luo River Lake Nilotes from southern Sudan, Bahr al Ghazal, the Highland Nilotes, the Plain Nilotes from Ethiopia, the Bantu migration to East Africa. The Bantu were a group of people who spoke a similar language characterized by the word Ntu or Ndu meaning a person. The Bantu are believed to have come from West Africa around the Cameroon Highlands or the Niger-Benue confluence basin around 2,000 years ago. It is from here that they moved to the Congo Basin or Katanga region or Shoba province, before settling in East Africa. Reasons for the Bantu migration from the homeland. The reasons for the migration of the Bantu are not clear. However, the following reasons could have pushed the Bantu out of their homeland. Population pressure or increase in their homeland resulted into shortage of land, leading to land conflicts which forced the Bantu to migrate to East Africa. The Bantu moved in search for fertile soils for agriculture since they practiced crop cultivation. This was after the soils in their original homeland had become infertile. Internal conflicts arising from family quarrels and political differences forced the Bantu to migrate from their original homeland. The Bantu experienced external conflicts from their neighbors like the Pygmies who attacked them and forced them out of their troubled original homeland. The hostile climatic conditions like drought caused a lot of suffering to the Bantu, which led to their migration to East Africa. The desire to export their iron working skills or culture and iron implements like hoes, spears, pangas and arrows to other people made the Bantu to migrate from their original homeland. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1888. D. The presence of animal diseases such as Negono and the Rinderpest disease also made the Bantu to migrate to East Africa so as to escape such diseases. The outbreak of severe famine that was characterized by acute shortage of food could also have forced the Bantu to migrate to East Africa. The flooding of River Congo in Central Africa and River Niger in West Africa could also have forced the Bantu to migrate to new areas which were free from floods and therefore suitable for settlement. The love for adventure forced the Bantu, especially the youth, to move as they were interested in knowing what was happening beyond their original homeland. The course of the Bantu migration. The Bantu entered East Africa in different groups, each using its own route. These groups included the Interlacustrine Western Bantu, the Central and Northern Bantu, the Highland and Coastal Bantu, and lastly the Southern Bantu. The Interlacustrine Bantu or Western Bantu were the first group of the Bantu-speaking people to migrate into East Africa. They formed the largest group of the Bantu to migrate to East Africa. They came probably from West Africa or southeastern Congo around 2,000 years ago. They entered East Africa in small groups or clan groups and did not settle in one place. Their migration spread over a long period of time and therefore it was slow and gradual. Sometimes their movement was seasonal depending on the climatic or seasonal changes. Their contacts were either peaceful or hostile depending on the response of the local people. They entered East Africa using the western route between Lake Albert and Lake Edward from the Katanga region or Shoba province. They settled within the shores of the Great Lakes of East Africa, Lakes Albert, Victoria, Edward, Kivu and Kyoga. Their migration is believed to have taken place between 1000 and 1300 AD before they finally settled in the Interlacustrine region. They then established large communities around the Great Lakes region of East Africa. Those who settled in the east and south of Lake Albert included the Banyoro and Patora. Those who settled in the west of Lake Victoria included Sumbaganda and Banyanku. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. Some moved eastwards along the northern shores of Lake Victoria into western Kenya. These gave rise to the Gisiu and Laya who settled around Munia's area. Some moved from western Uganda to northwestern Tanzania and settled at Bukoba and Karagwe. They included the Bahinda. The Bantu in this group were basically agriculturalists, though they practiced some pastoralism or cattle keeping. The Chwezi later took control of their area and ruled them until 1500 AD. Then the Luo invaded and conquered the Chwezi and established their dynasty known as the Luo Babita. The second group of Bantu to migrate to East Africa was that of the Central and Northern Bantu. They entered East Africa using the central route between Lakes Edward and Tanganyika and first settled in central Tanganyika. They formed some tribes like the Sukuma, Nyamwezi, Sinza, and Gogo. Their migration is believed to have taken place between 1000 and 1300 AD. They were initially farmers, but with time they adopted a semi-pastoral life because of poor soils, while others adopted trade like the Nyamwezi. The third group of Bantu to migrate to East Africa was that of the Coastal and Highland Bantu. They were also known as the Eastern Bantu. Their original homeland was Cameroon in West Africa and Katanga region of southeastern Congo. Their movement was slow and gradual and therefore was spread over a long period of time. At times, their movements were seasonal depending on the climatic changes. They entered East Africa under different groups and clans. They entered East Africa through the southwestern part of Tanganyika, between the north of Lake Tanganyika and south of Lake Victoria between 1000 and 1300 AD. They settled along the coast and highlands, hence the name Coastal and Highland Bantu. They moved to the Tanganyika Plateau and then proceeded to the Teta Hills and Kilimanjaro areas. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. Those who moved to the coast intermarried with the coastal Arabs, leading to the formation of the Swahili people. While at the coast or Shangwea, pressure from the Gala people caused further dispersal of the Bantu to different directions. Due to this pressure, the Neka and Pokoma moved southwards along the coast. Another group of the eastern Bantu was forced away from Shangwea to the Kenyan highlands. This group included the Chuku, Kikuyu, Kamba and Mbu. These came to be known as the Island Bantu. The Chuka came up to River Tona and arrived around 1300 AD. The Mbu followed and arrived around 1450 AD. Finally, the Kikuyu arrived around 1500 AD. Their migration was however checked and stopped by the Maasai. The Eastern Bantu occupied the region between east of the Rift Valley in Kenya and north East Tanganyika. The southern Tanzania Bantu formed the fourth group of Bantu to migrate to East Africa. Their migration took place between 1300 AD. They entered East Africa through the western direction from southeastern Congo or West Africa. They used the route between Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika. They settled in southern Tanganyika in areas such as Ruvuma, Sonjia and Embe. They included Hihi, Au, Pagoro, Saramo, Makan, Bena, Njindo, Gogo and Rufiji. The Ngoni, around 1840, another Bantu group moved into East Africa, and these were the Ngoni who came from South Africa and formed the last wave of the Bantu migration into East Africa. Effects of the migration and settlement of Bantu in East Africa. The effects of the Bantu migration were many on the people of East Africa as shown below. Introduced the knowledge of iron making and made a number of iron implements like spears, arrowheads, slashes, hoes and pangas among others. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. They introduced new languages in East Africa like Renyankul, Luganda and Lusoga. They absorbed most of the non-Bantu people who eventually lost their identity like the Kushites and Bushmen. Some of those who refused to be absorbed migrated to other areas. Their coming led to the rise of new tribes in East Africa like Baganda and Basoga, Banankot, among others. They intermarried with the Arabs at the East African coast, and this gave rise to the Swahili people at the coast of East Africa. They introduced new fighting tactics in East Africa like the cowhorn formation of attacking enemies by encircling them. The Bantu introduced new weapons such as assegai, cowhide shields and arrowheads. Their coming led to increased trading activities between the coastal Arabs and the interior people. They introduced their culture and traditions to the people of East Africa like Bokwazi. They introduced permanent settlement along their rivers and new lakes in East Africa like Lake Victoria, Lake Edward and Lake Albert. Their coming led to the introduction of fishing and boat building around the lakes and rivers in East Africa into East Africa. They introduced animal rearing in East Africa, for example the rearing longhorn cattle, goats and sheep. They introduced a centralized system of administration with the king as the ruler in East Africa. This was common in kingdoms like Buganda, Karagwe, Toro and Kula Nyamwezi. Introduced new crops in East Africa such as banana, yams and beans, which improved on the diet of the people of East Africa. They introduced the growing of crops on a large scale like bananas using iron tools such as hoes, sashes, axes, pangas to East Africa. Their coming led to increase in population in East Africa since they came with an idea of polygamous marriages. They displaced many people from their original homes and villages like the Bushmen, Khoikhoi, as well as the Bokwazi, and they took over their land. The Bantu in some cases abandoned their cultures and copied those of the people they met. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. Their coming late led to depopulation in some areas like central and southern Tanzania due to increased slave activities that they carried out. The migration of the Luo or River Lake Nilotes to East Africa. The Luo were a group who belonged to the River Lake Nilotes. They were called River Lake Nilotes because they settled along rivers and lakes. They were referred to as the Jonom. The Luo moved from their cradle-land homeland in the equatorial province of southern Sudan or Bahr el-Ghazal during the late 15th century into East Africa. Reasons for the Luo migration to East Africa. The reasons for their migration are still debatable or not clear. However, the following could have forced them to migrate from their homeland. The Luo moved due to overpopulation in the homeland, which resulted into overcrowding and land conflicts. Overstocking in their original lands resulted into overgrazing of animals, which forced the Luo to migrate to East Africa, moved in search for water and pasture for their animals in East Africa, since some of them kept animals like cattle. The love for adventure and exploration forced the Luo, especially the youths, to move from their original homeland to East Africa. They were interested in knowing what was happening in other areas. The presence of animal diseases such as Nagona and the rinderpest disease made the Luo to migrate to East Africa so as to escape such diseases. The presence of human diseases in their original lands like malaria, smallpox and sleeping sickness also made the Luo to move to East Africa. Internal conflicts in their original areas such as civil wars over land and animals forced the Luo to migrate to East Africa. They also moved due to external conflicts with their neighbors like the Gala and Kushites from Ethiopia. The Luo moved due to floods in their original land since they lived along the banks of River Nile. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. The Luo were looking for fertile soils for agriculture in East Africa, since some of them were farmers and yet the soils in their homeland had become infertile. The migration and settlement of the course the Luo migration to East Africa up to 1800 AD. The Luo originally settled at Bahr el Ghazal in the equatorial province of southern Sudan. Their movement started in 1400 AD from Bahr el Ghazal. Their movement spread over a long period of between AD 1400 and 1800, and therefore it was slow and gradual. They moved in small families or clan groups. At times their movements were seasonal, depending on the climatic or seasonal changes. They moved southwards following the Nile River. They entered East Africa through northern Uganda or Nimule. Between 1480 and 1500 AD, they had settled at Pibangu, present-day Pakwach. This later became a major dispersal point to different directions. One group under Jupia and Tifil moved westwards and mixed with the Sudanic Madi, Opu, and Lendu, giving rise to the Alo people. A second group, the Jobitu clan under Labonga, moved southwards into Pawichope at the time when the Banyoro-Katara Empire under the Chwezi dynasty was disintegrating, collapsing. This group set up the Babito dynasty in Banyoro together with other sub-dynasties in areas like Buganda, Ankole and Bukede. Further movements occurred northwards, eastwards and northeastwards into present-day Achole, Lango and other areas. Most prominent of the migrants at the time was the Labongo group, who intermarried with the Madi to give rise to the Acholi tribe. Some continued to the shores of Lake Kyaga and absorbed the Aika and influenced the Langu language. Those who moved into Kenya included the Jokajok, Jokoone, Jokomolo and the Basuba. Between 1500 and 1550, the Jokajok moved directly from Sudan through Acholi. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. They were led by the fearless Oeniskoma. Between 1550 and 1650, the Jokomolo moved from northern Banyoro through Bigogo, Bidoma, and also settled in Nyanza region. The Abasubo, a group of refugees from Buganda, the SC's islands Busoga and Bugwa, migrated between 1600 and 1800. Today, this group is represented by the Jojem, Jo Eugenia and Jo Aligo, who mainly settled in southern Nyanza. The Luo group that finally settled in Kavirondo Gulf and the Nyanza region came to be known as the Kenyan Uyoliu. In conclusion, by 1800 the Luo had settled in East Africa. Effects of the Luo migration on the people of East Africa. The Luo established themselves as rulers over the local people in East Africa. There were intermarriages between the Luo and the local people, leading to the rise of new tribes like Ala, Kiman, Acholi, Japatol and Langi, among others. The Luo introduced their languages in East Africa like Acholi, Ala and Japatola that came to be spoken in East Africa. The coming of the Luo led to the decline of the Chwezi Empire of Banyoro-Katara in western Uganda. Small independent states emerged like Buganda, Busoga, Ankole and Karagwe as a result of the coming of the Luo to East Africa. They established the Luo-Beta dynasty in Banyoro region, which lasted for 4 to 5 centuries, up to 1967 when kingdoms in Uganda were abolished. Also, Luo sub-dynasties ruled over a large area in Busoga, Karagwe, Ankole and western Kenya. The coming of the Luo led to the displacement of some people like the Bahiman, Banyoro, Lendu and Opu from their original homelands. The population increased in East Africa, especially in northern Uganda and western Kenya, due to the coming of the Luo, which led to land disputes or conflicts due to the constant quarrels. They introduced the idea of chiefdoms or wathans in East Africa, which did not exist there before their coming, and they imposed themselves as chiefs over the local people of East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. They introduced petty names in Poku like Akaki, Amity, Diari, Etienne, and Atwiki among others, especially in Bunyoro and Toro. They started the idea of giving land to clans in East Africa which did not exist there before their coming. They introduced the system of royal burial sites for a Bakoma in East Africa, like Kasubai tombs for the Baskabok at the Buganda and Empolo in Horn for the Omikoma. They introduced new royal regalia in East Africa which comprised of royal drums, shields, royal fire spears and stools. They introduced some new crops in East Africa like millet, simsim, peas and sorghum. Since they practiced cultivation, there was destruction of property and loss of life in East Africa due to the intertribal wars caused by the movements of the Luo in East Africa. The migration of the Highland Nilotes to East Africa. These were groups of Nilotes who settled on the highlands of East Africa. They include tribes like the Nandi, Kalenjin, Pokot, Marakwet, etc. They included groups of farmers and pastoralists. They came to East Africa from southwest Ethiopia. They entered East Africa from Lake Turkana and settled in the eastern side of Mountain Elgon. The first of these groups to arrive in East Africa were the Kalenjin. The Kalenjin got divided into two groups around 1300. One group came to be known as the Pokotsak. The migration of the Plain Nilotes to East Africa. The Plain Nilotes were a group of Nilotes who decided to settle in large and open areas plains of East Africa like eastern Uganda and in the western parts of Kenya. They were basically pastoralists who practiced cattle keeping and mainly kept short-horned cattle and always raided their neighbours for cattle. They included groups like the Mosai, Aitso, Karamojong, Jai, Pokot, Samburu and Turkana, among others. They entered East Africa through the northeastern direction. They migrated from the southern part of the Ethiopian highlands around 1000–1800 AD into East African history. Migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. Population increase in the cradle land forced them to search for new areas for settlement. Since land wasn't enough to accommodate the number of people, they migrated in search for fertile soils due to soil exhaustion in their home areas. For example, the Mosai group practiced some cultivation and this made them to come to East Africa. They were looking for pasture and water for their animals since they were cattle keepers and their homeland was experiencing shortage of water and pasture. They were running away from prolonged drought in their homeland which had created shortage of pasture and water for their animals. The outbreak of human disease like malaria, river blindness and sleeping sickness in their homeland forced them to migrate to East Africa. Internal conflicts and intertribal wars caused by family quarrels and clan misunderstandings forced them to migrate to East Africa. External conflicts from their neighbours, especially the Kushites and Gal, also forced them to migrate to East Africa. The love for adventure among the Plain Nilotes, especially the youth, also made them to move to new areas to discover more new things. The outbreak of famine in their homeland killed many people and this forced those who survived to search for food for themselves in East Africa. The outbreak of cattle diseases like Nagona, the Rhindopest as well as the Furtimal disease forced them to migrate to East Africa so as to avoid such diseases. The course of the migration of and settlement of the Plain Nilotes in East Africa. Their movement spread for a long period of time stretching between 1000 and 1800 AD in East Africa. Sometimes their movements were seasonal depending on climatic or seasonal changes. They usually moved in small family or clan groups. They migrated from the southern slopes of the Ethiopian highlands around 1000 AD. From the southern Ethiopian highlands, they moved southwards up to Lake Rudolf Turkana. Lake Rudolf Turkana therefore became the dispersal point to the different parts of East African history. Migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. The Tiso Mosai was divided into three groups and these were the Mosai, Karamojong and Lutuko. However, the Lutuko moved northwards and finally settled in Sudan. The Mosai moved southwards and settled in Kenya between Mountain Kilimanjaro and the Taita Hills. Other groups of Mosai moved southwards along the East African Rift Valley in Kenya and Tanganyika. The Mosai settled between Uasin-Gishu Plateau and Seroma in southern Tanganyika, Tanzania. By the 17th century, the Mosai had separated into 16 independent groups, each with its own territory. The Isa and Karamojong first settled on Mountain Morota before their major dispersal at Gerd. The Karamojong first moved from Mountain Morota southwestward and westwards and finally settled in the present-day south and central Karamoja. The Dodoth and Jai moved northwards and settled in the present-day Kotido district in the northeastern part of Uganda. The Turkana moved northeastwards into present-day northern Kenya. The effects of their migration and settlement in East Africa. There was population increase in East Africa due to the coming of the Plain Nilotes to areas like western Kenya and eastern Uganda. They copied the idea of crop cultivation from the Bantu people they found in East Africa. For example, the Mosai became mixed farmers. They displaced people on their lands like the Akamba and Kikuyu. They also introduced the idea of cattle keeping in parts of East Africa like eastern Uganda and western part of Kenya, since it was their way of life. They intermarried with the people of East Africa like the Luo, which resulted into the birth of new tribes like the Langi. They copied the idea of iron working from the Cushites and Bantu people whom they found in East Africa. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. They became rulers of many societies in East Africa since they were aggressive and warlike people. For example, the Mosai established their military control over the Chaga and the Kalenjin. They absorbed the conquered people into their societies like the Chaga and Kalenjin. They introduced the short-horned cattle in East Africa, which were drought-resistant breeds, found mainly in eastern Uganda and the western part of Kenya. They traded with their neighbours like the Aita traded with the Banyoro in Uganda and the Maasai with the Kalenjin in Kenya. They introduced pastoralism to the people of East Africa, especially the Nandi and Kikuyu. They introduced new crops in East Africa like cereals such as millet, peas and sorghum. Their coming led increased insecurity, wars and raiding in East Africa due to the need for more land for settlement. Their coming led to loss of lives among the people of East Africa due to increased wars for cattle. Their coming led to massive destruction of property in East Africa since their contacts with the local people were hostile. The Karamojong and Aitso migration to East Africa. The Karamojong and Aitso belonged to the Plain Nilotes group of people. Under the Ika family, they were related to the Turkana, Kumam and Mosai. They were basically pastoralists and therefore they practiced cattle keeping and kept mainly short-horned cattle. Reasons for the migration of the Karamojong and Aitso to East Africa. The reasons for their migration are not clear but depended on their way of life as shown below. They were looking for pasture and water for their animals since in their original lands there was lack of water and pasture. Population increased in their home and forced them to look for new areas that were free from population pressure. Internal conflicts like civil wars also forced the Karamojong and Aitso to migrate from their East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1880 AD. The outbreak of severe famine in their homeland forced many people to move away in search for food that was very scarce. Overstocking and overgrazing caused the problem of land shortage, which forced them to migrate to other areas where they could find enough land to graze their animals. The love for adventure among the Karamojong and Aitso people also made them to move to new areas to discover more new things. They also migrated in search for fertile soils since they practiced cultivation and the soils in their homeland had become infertile. The outbreak of cattle diseases like Nagona, the Rinderpest as well as the foot and mouth disease forced them to migrate to East Africa so as to avoid such diseases. The presence of human diseases in their original lands like malaria, smallpox and sleeping sickness also made the Karamojong and Aitso to move to East Africa. The course of the Karamojong and Aitso migration to East Africa. The movement of the Karamojong and Aitso into East Africa was slow and gradual. Their movement spread over a long period of time stretching from 1000 to 1800 AD. Sometimes their movements were seasonal and depended on climatic or seasonal changes. They moved into East Africa in small family or clan groups. They migrated probably from the southern slopes of the Ethiopian highlands around 1000 AD. From the Ethiopian highlands, they moved southwards and settled north of Lake Rudolph, Turkana in Kenya. Lake Rudolph Turkana became the dispersal point from where they moved to various directions. The Tisa Mosai group was divided into three groups, namely the Mosai at Lutuko and the Aitso Karamojong. The Aitso and Karamojong moved further south and first settled at Mount Imorota before their major dispersal occurred during the 17th and 18th centuries. From the Suck Hills in Karamoja, the Karamojong stayed behind in the original open dry place, as people who were unwilling to move away. They further dispersed and moved into the area between Mountain Napak and Lake Bysina. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1888 AD. The Aitso group, who were mainly young adventurous men, moved and first settled in Uzuk and Emuria counties. They later moved to the Kayuga areas and settled in the present-day Soroti, Kumi, Kabramedo and Palisa district. They came into contact with the Langi, intermarried with them and formed the Kimam. They adopted the life and ways of the agriculturalists and therefore they produced enough food for their survival. Due to this food security, the population increased greatly. This sparked off further movements into the present-day Tororo district and western Kenya. In Tororo, they settled in the present-day Kwapa, Morakate, Asanj, Amagoro and Mela areas. In Kenya, they settled in Maloba and Amangira areas. However, the Aitso continued to keep some animals but took up agriculture since they came to more fertile lands than they previously occupied. Effects of the Karamojong and Aitso migration and settlement. Their migration led to population increase in East African areas like eastern Uganda and Western Kenya where they settled. Their coming led to land conflicts due to the increase in population in the areas they occupied. They displaced some people from their original homelands. These included the Bamasoba, Vajisu and Bakusu among others. They the Bajisu to move eastwards to the present-day Bujusiland and Western Kenya. They forced the Bajisu community to become united in order to guard against the Aitso invasion. Their migration led to intertribal wars between the Aitso and the Luo people in eastern Uganda. Like the Japatola, there were intermarriages between the Aitso and the local people like the Langi, leading to the rise of new tribes like the Kumem. Trade activities increased between the Aitso and their neighbours like the Banyoro. They acquired new farming skills from the Bantu people of East Africa like the growing of sweet potatoes and groundnuts. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1888 D. They adopted some customs and cultures of the Bajisu after they intermarried with them. For example, there was circumcision of the Boers as they introduced them to adulthood. They formed new decentralized states in the East African areas where they settled. The Maasai migration into East Africa. The Maasai were a group of people who belonged to the Plain Nilotes. They originally occupied the area between Mountain Kenya and Lake Rudolph Turkana. Their migration took place between 1650 and 1700 AD. Reasons for the migration of the Maasai to East Africa. They were looking for pasture and water for their animals since they were pastoralists or cattle keepers. Population increase resulted into overpopulation in their homeland, which forced them to look for new areas for settlement in East Africa. Overstocking and overgrazing caused a problem of land shortage and land conflicts among the Maasai, which forced them to migrate. The prolonged drought, harsh climate in their original lands caused shortage of water and pasture for their animals, which forced them to migrate. The outbreak of human diseases like smallpox, malaria and sleeping sickness in their homeland forced them to migrate to safer areas. Internal conflicts and tribal wars caused mainly by family quarrels or clan misunderstandings forced them to migrate to East Africa. External conflicts from their neighbours like the Kushites and Gal also led to their migration to East Africa. The love for adventure forced some of them to migrate, especially the youth, as they wanted to discover new things in other areas. The outbreak of famine in their homeland, which killed many people, also forced the Maasai to migrate in search for food for themselves. The Maasai were naturally an aggressive society, and therefore they wanted to raid other areas for cattle, which forced them to migrate. Effects of the Maasai migration and settlement on the people of East Africa. The Maasai migration stretched through the East Africa Rift Valley out to Dodoma in present. East African history, migrations and settlement in East Africa 1888 D. There were intermarriages between the Maasai and the local people of East Africa, giving rise to new tribes in Kenya and Tanzania. They adopted the ideas of agriculture from the Bantu people whom they found in Kenya and Tanzania. The Maasai established control over a large area of central Kenya as well as central Tanzania, where they became rulers since they were aggressive and warlike people. They displaced many local people from their homes like the Kikuyu, Kalenjin and Chaga. As a result, they remained the most powerful people on the plains of central Kenya and northern Tanzania. They raided their neighbours for cattle like the Chaga, Taita and Kamba. They absorbed the conquered people into their societies like the Kalenjin of Kenya and Chaga of Tanzania, whose culture and language were absorbed by the Maasai. They introduced the idea of cattle keeping in those areas where they settled since it was their way of life, and they kept short-horned cattle. They copied the idea of iron working from the Kushites and Bantu people whom they found in Kenya and Tanzania. They carried out trade with their neighbours in Kenya like the Kikuyu and Nandi. Their coming led to increased insecurity or wars in East Africa, which caused depopulation in Kenya and Tanzania. Their coming led to massive destruction of property since their contact with their local people